Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, recently we looked at some plans from the Lusitania sister ship, the Mauritania. They were truly beautiful works of art, hand-drawn, coloured, really, really lovely. And I've been thinking about what plans to do next. We've got a few that you guys asked for, like the Great Eastern and the Queen Mary. But recently I was doing some research for a video and I came across a pretty interesting plan, one that I've seen before, but forgot existed. And I thought that we could have a look through it today. It's of the Titanic, but it's a pretty interesting plan in particular because there aren't that many plans of Titanic that exist because they've kind of been scattered to the four winds. Some have essentially just disappeared, possibly into private collections. It's said that some were destroyed during the Blitz on Belfast in World War II when Harland and Wolff was bombed. But the truth is, a lot of the plans that exist that we have are of Olympic. Some of them are really badly sort of hodged into looking like Titanic, but they're not. This one, however, is the Titanic. And I thought what we'd do is have a look through, because it is quite rare to see general arrangement plans of Titanic that are, first of all, accurate, and second of all, from the actual era that Titanic existed in. Now, just to zoom in and give you a bit of an idea of what these plans look like in the first place. They're pretty basic looking when you take a look at the side profile here. It's a very simple layout of the side profile of the ship, the general arrangement, the decks and that kind of thing. But where there's a lot more detail is down here on the decks below. Now, unfortunately, this one only goes down to C deck. So it shows all of the exposed decks where you would have had literally decking, weather decks exposed to the elements. And then everything below, D deck, E deck, F deck, we can't see. The truth is, though, these are probably some of the more interesting decks on Titanic. So let's have a look through and see what this is trying to tell us, what it tells us about the Titanic, and some of the differences between this plan and some other plans that you might find online. Now, this is available online. It's in the US National Archives, and I'll provide a link to that in the description of the video. Now, already what's kind of unusual about this plan that marks it out as being a little bit different to others is that, for one, it shows that they installed the screens. So the Titanic's promenade was half enclosed to provide some shelter for first-class passengers when they were walking. And it's actually been marked out on this plan, which is unusual because this was a very, very late addition to Titanic. She had originally been intended to have this large exposed open promenade like Olympic had, except that in the event, Harland and Wolff down on B deck with White Star Line's direction ended up converting what was a very, very long enclosed promenade into some of the finest suites on the ship. Beautiful staterooms and things on B deck. So you can see here on the port side, we've got B18, B22, B28. On Olympic, at the start of her career, these didn't exist. This was just a clear walkway. And eventually Harland and Wolff, with White Star, after doing tests on Olympic and seeing how she was going, realised that actually people aren't really probably using it that much. That's a lot of walking space just for first class. Better to use that tonnage, better to use that internal space for, things people can spend money on, like, for example, nicer staterooms. It meant, though, that they deleted the enclosed promenade. Now, to counter that, they put some screens up on A deck, which was the open promenade, converting it to like half and half, which would have been pretty nice and sheltered. You can see actually at the forward end here on A deck, there are these screens with doors on them, so that would have prevented wind from ripping down the promenade deck. Anyone who's ever been at sea on a big ship like this or taken a transatlantic voyage knows just how windy it can get even during the summer. The ship's already, during 21 knots, 22 knots forward, there's a lot of wind coming back at you, especially if you've got a headwind, then it's kind of like double that speed. So anything you can do to, give as much protection to your passengers is a bonus. So on Titanic, they've installed these doors. What makes the plan a bit weird is that they've actually marked it out on the plan where the screens are and where they end. Which, like I said, pretty unusual because this was a last-minute change to Titanic's design. Relatively last minute. You can see when she's being fitted out, that promenade's nice and open. It's led a lot of people to kind of get confused and mix photos up between Titanic and Olympic. But it's a little bit unusual to have a period plan. So one thing I've always wondered is, why does this plan exist? Why was it made? And I've never really known the answer to that. I had assumed, because it was in the American National Archives, that it had somehow got to America. Great assumption on my part. Why? Well, we know, of course, that there were a series of inquiries into the Titanic disaster, the first headed up by US Senator Smith, right after the disaster in 1912. But a friend of mine, a researcher, Troy Cullen, who works with the Titanic Honour and Glory, told me that these plans probably date to about 1915, when there were further hearings for limitation of liability and that kind of thing. All the, the claims and that were being heard by the White Star Line. We did a video on that just recently. It's a really interesting story. And so these plans were used to essentially show where the particulars of the ship were, explain how people might have got to the boats and that kind of thing, because they were trying to find if Hull and Wolff or White Star Line might have been liable for the loss of their ship, damages, loss of life, and that kind of thing. The reason the location of the screen installations here is important is because if you look at the decks above, you can see that there are lifeboats gathered forward, and of course the deck below, A deck, is screened off there. This kind of had an impact on the night of the sinking, because Captain Smith had ordered his boats lowered to A deck where they could be boarded by passengers, because that was the right thing to do. That was the official evacuation plan for the Olympic class, Olympic and Titanic. Obviously neglecting or forgetting the fact that the forward boats had been screened off, and there were these windows there which had big hand cranks. The crew needed to go and find the cranks, try and get the windows down. In the event, one lifeboat was half lowered down to A deck and kind of neglected and forgotten about for the rest of the sinking right until the end, because they couldn't actually get the windows down in time. And eventually it got away. But obviously it created a little bit of confusion. So that last minute addition, they probably didn't update the evacuation plan, or if they did, Captain Smith, in the event, kind of forgot about it. So it's interesting that that screen change is included on the plan here. Whereas down on B deck, if we look down here, now this is towards the stern of the ship, another big change that they made to B deck was the addition of a cafe parisien on Titanic. Now this was meant to be a nice light and airy kind of cafe, and it was clearly a very last minute change, because in essence, the restaurant here, the a la carte restaurant, sometimes called the Ritz restaurant, it was additional to your fare. You had to essentially pay extra, so you ordered off the menu like you would in a normal restaurant. It wasn't included in your first class fare. It was so popular on Olympic that they ended up extending it out on the port side of the ship, the left-hand side of the ship. So you can actually see here, it's very clear to see where they've made these clever changes, because where the cabins are over here on the right, where the promenade is over here on the left, in the middle you've got the restaurant. Now, originally on Olympic, that was all open promenade, so you can actually follow the line of the bulkhead where it would have originally been, here's where the inside of the ship ends and here's where the promenade is. But White Star Line has very cleverly used this space for new things, new rooms, that kind of thing. Now, on the starboard side of the ship, on the right-hand side, the White Star Line had made provisions for what they had originally termed a restaurant promenade, and it seems to me that they've just kind of reserved this space, partly because one of the criticisms of Olympic's original design is that this was originally second-class promenade, and they could look in the windows at the first-class passengers eating lunch and dinner at the restaurant, which is probably not what you want. A little bit voyeuristic. So there was originally a plan to just maybe have a promenade there, and they maybe didn't really know what they wanted to do with the space. In the end, in a very clever, again, last-minute change, they installed what they called the Café Parisien. It was essentially just lattice work on the wall so they could have ivy, placed on it to make it look like a garden. I'm fairly certain the ivy was fake. And then just some very light wicker furniture. And boom, you've now got a new space where passengers can kind of sit and sip their tea and just relax. And it ended up being extremely popular. More popular than other first-class spaces on the ship, like the reading and writing room, for example. And so, in the event, it was also put on the Olympic and slightly improved. The decor was a little bit nicer. So yeah, it's a really nice little room. But it's interesting that on this plan, you can see that they still kind of didn't really know what they wanted to do with it, and they just called it a restaurant promenade. Like, oh, we'll just put a restaurant promenade here. One of the other things interesting about this plan is that on a lot of plans called Titanic, that are clearly actually Olympic, you'll see that these stairs in particular here that go down from B deck into the well deck at the stern of the ship are in the correct position that they were when the ship was finished. They're sort of centrally located right at the end of the promenade there on either side of the ship. But the original plan for Olympic and Titanic had them coming out at a really awkward angle just here. So they would splay outwards from either side of the second class deck house here. And why this was changed, I don't really know. When Olympic was being built, they changed it. And the stairs, in theory, would have been really just used for crew to get around the ship, because the space below this is the well deck is for third class. But the space above this deck that we're looking at here, this is a second class space. So it's gated. You wouldn't have had passengers going up and down there. Presumably, maybe it was just a little bit awkward having the stairs splaying out like that. They might have got in the way a little bit. So in the event, they changed it. These are the kinds of stairs that passengers complained about being locked during the sinking. There were little gates, they're about knee-high, and they did separate third class from second class, and even first class spaces at the forward end of the ship. But they weren't the kind of Bostwick gates we imagine when we picture third class people being locked below deck on Titanic. They were really just, maybe waist height and very easily crossed over. In the event of Titanic sinking, actually, a lot of passengers did gather down here in third class, down on the well deck, down here. The boat deck is about 2 or 3 decks above, and the stairs and the ladders leading up there, they had these locked gates that are, again, only waist high. And although they're not really much of a physical barrier, they serve to be more of like a mental barrier. These are people in a very class-based society, and there's a gate there with a sign saying essentially third-class passengers not allowed beyond this point. And although you could very easily climb and jump over it, step over it, it creates a psychological barrier to doing so. And so it has to be said that in subsequent inquiries, the findings from the British inquiry and the limitation of liability hearings were that no passenger of any class would have found it harder, essentially, to get into the boats. That each class and each person on board had their own, had equal chances of getting into a lifeboat. Which is ridiculous. The third class are berthed way, way, way below the boats, forward and aft of them. They'd never been up to the boat deck, they hadn't conducted drills on where to go in the event of an emergency, and then you had these gates that, even though they aren't the ones you see in the movie, where they're literally locked shut, floor to ceiling, they're waiting there for instructions. Some of them have got their bags, and they waited down here, and help didn't come. No one came really to get them. A lot of them were stuck waiting around until the very end, when there was a little bit of effort to go and gather third-class passengers, and some just kind of found their own way forward, because it's really tricky to get from this place here, the third-class promenade, the well deck, all the way up here to the boat deck, because there's no direct external connector between these decks, apart from very, very, very small vertical ladders that you can see. One marked here on the plan, which again is very interesting that they've included that very small detail, and 2 marked down here on either side of the A deck terminal, the end of the A deck promenade. Looking down on C deck, because I think we've done similar videos to this before, and we haven't talked a lot about C deck, even though I think it's a pretty interesting deck as far as Titanic's concerned. You can see, first of all, how densely packed with cabins it is. So designing a ship is really just an equation. You have to get as many people as you can into a single hull as you can. And then that will dictate how many people are willing to pay for tickets, how many people you can actually fit, how much fuel you'll have to take to carry them a certain distance. So, you're constantly balancing. And so Harland & Wolff had the challenge of using this huge hull, 45,000 gross registered tons, the internal usable volume of the ship, and filling it with as many staterooms as they could. It meant that en-suites and toilets and things, en-suites weren't a thing back then. It was extremely unusual and rare. Ships started to kind of do it towards the end of the 1910s, the beginning of the 1920s, as standards changed. But back then, life was a lot more communal, and private bathing wasn't very very common on liners. And so you see a lot of bathrooms built into hallways. So you can see here there's a ladies' lavatory forward in this block of first-class staterooms, and then back here we've got the gents' lavatory, and they're separated by a big boiler casing for funnel number 1's uptakes from the boiler rooms. So yeah, you would have had people in first class coming out in their pajamas with their dressing gowns on to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Now, that's a funny mental image because we like to think of this as, the ultimate in luxury and, the horror that you might be spotted by a gentleman in his beautiful white tie coming back from a card game when you're standing there in your pajamas waiting to use the loo. To kind of provide a little bit of privacy, you can see that the corridors were guarded by what they call baize doors. Now, baize doors are essentially doors with a fabric or leather covering on them. It looks nice, first of all, but also has a very practical purpose. Now, first of all, on Titanic, it meant that there was a door on the corridors, so it meant that, maybe the corridor is a little bit more obscured from view, so if someone's doing a late-night toilet run, it might be harder to see them. Titanics had portholes in them, as far as I can recall, but at least it was, a little protection. But the other thing here is sound. Sound travels through old ships like this like nothing else. I don't know if any of you guys have stayed on the Queen Mary, for example, but, the deck plating and the bulkhead plating is extremely thin. And you can hear everything. I was kept awake at night on the Queen Mary by people doing all kinds of things in the middle of the night, and you really can hear everything. And, I don't think it really makes it into the books or the written experience of what it was like to be on ocean liners back in the day, because that's just kind of how life was. People were used to it. Whereas it's kind of jarring to stay on a modern ship today where it's really, really well insulated and the steel is a little thicker and you can't hear as much. And then go on a ship from the 30s or before, and then you just kind of hear everything. So they were doing everything they could to make it so that people had their privacy and were also not being kept up by noise. And so having baized thick doors guarding your corridors meant that these big passenger public hubs like the first class entrance, the public rooms up here on A deck and things like that, where you've got a lot of noise of people gathering and congregating, the noise is not going to then disperse out into the corridor. So presumably these passenger blocks, we'll call them, will be a little more quiet. Another thing that they did to kind of preserve people's quiet and peace was to put time restrictions on when people could do full deck promenading. So as part of the signage for the promenade decks on A deck for first class passengers, it requested specifically that at certain times of the day and night you didn't promenade past a certain point. Purely because, you've got big wooden soled shoes walking on the decks. If you're walking past these staterooms up here on A deck, they're going to hear it. But the people down here on B deck are going to hear it because you're walking right over the top of their heads. And again, you can really hear stuff on these old ships. And in the event of the sinking, a lot of crew and passengers were woken by commotion. People rushing about overhead and that kind of thing. And you can really understand why, because the decking is so thin. So yeah, Harlan and Wolff using any opportunity they can to make things a little bit more comfortable for their passengers. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about the plan is they show where the private promenades for the suites were located. So these were the most luxurious cabins on the ship. The one on the port side is most famous from the film Titanic, because at the start, the man's man, the valet, Lovejoy, says they're sending their things to staterooms B52 and 54 and 56. Kind of a weird choice. You can see them here. Bit of a weird choice because 52, 54, and 56 were actually occupied by Bruce Ismay in real life. Ismay was, of course, the chairman of the White Star Line, and he had the finest staterooms on the ship. He had 52 and 54 and 56. The other side was occupied by a female passenger traveling by herself, Mrs. Cardeza, and she had the other set of suites. It's kind of weird that Cameron put the fictitious DeWitt Bucator family in 52 and 54 and 56, when it was occupied by probably one of the most famous people on the ship, and not the other one, which was slightly less famous. Now, again, on Olympic, this private promenade setup really didn't exist to begin with, but they had learned enough from Titanic that, yeah, this was a really clever use of space. It's a great marketing tool, having this kind of Tudor private promenade look really, really nice. And so you can see that it's a fairly comprehensive setup of rooms, where you've actually got 56 here with sleeping space for 2, 54 with sleeping space for 2, and 52, which functions really just as a sitting room. So the sitting room for these, private suites was bigger than many of these first-class staterooms forward of it, like B48, 44, this whole block. Those are smaller staterooms than just the sitting room alone. So yeah, these were really, really nice spaces to occupy, extremely expensive, but you can see probably one of the biggest selling points of these is that they had their own ensuite, and not just their own toilets, but their own baths as well. And that's really significant, because you'll notice back here on this deck, there's blocks of baths, but there's not that many. There's 3 here and 3 here. So 6 baths for however many people were staying in here. The numbers below the stateroom numbers, B16 for example, here says 3. That indicates that there could be sleeping space for 3 people at a maximum. And they did that from having small bunks, fold-out couches that could be turned into beds and that kind of thing. So again, they're trying to get as many people as they can into the ship, and part of that involves having toilet blocks that are communal and kind of not distasteful, but a bit weird to us today in 2024. Yeah, this is a really interesting plan. It's pretty detailed, and it's also fairly accurate, which again is unusual for surviving period plans from Titanic's era. So I'll include the link to this plan in the description of the video, maybe pin the top comment. If you guys have any questions, if you want to download the plan and have a look around yourself, and if you come across something that you think is a little bit weird, please go ahead and leave a comment in the top pinned comment, and I'll get around to answering as many as I can. Because you can really lose yourself looking at this stuff. This is a really interesting plan. It's marked out some cool stuff. So let me know. Hope you've enjoyed this video. We'll continue our Grand Plans series by looking at something less Titanic-y next time. We might take a look at the Great Eastern or another forgotten ship from history like it. So until then, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.